Everybody, I want to welcome David Snavely to our short little LinkedIn Live session here. David and I love to discuss and geek out about culture and teams and all sorts of things. And David has a phenomenal background for this. He has a deep passion about culture, helping organizations create ones they love or perhaps tweak the ones that aren't working so well for them. He's worked over 20 years in lots of different industries helping organizations deliver great impact by looking at themselves and how they construct the teams and organizations that they want across a wide range of industries, for profit, nonprofit, big and small. And so I just thought David and I could have a fantastic short conversation for all of us where we ask and answer a couple of key questions about these topics and look for some nuggets of wisdom. And I think they're in here. We're going to find them. So, David, welcome.
Well, thank
Um,
you.
yeah, good to have you here.
Pleasure being
Um,
here.
yeah, there's a piece that I'd like to kick off between us, which is as we look at teams as the unit of analysis here. So rather than a large culture and how that might show up all over the place, but a team or many teams inside of an organization. Um, I think you and I share some perspective. Like we want teams to be effective, like, and that effectiveness can show up in terms of helping them accomplish what's most important to them, but also creating the lived experience that they want to have. And I'm wondering, in the 20 years you've been doing this work, have you seen organizations, team leaders, teams dig into that really well? And if so, what perspectives do they take as they try to create this reality?
Yeah, thank you for having me, first of all. Yeah, I mean, I work with a lot of clients. A lot of times clients will start off as at the organization level. They'll sort of
Yeah.
define, if you will, the values and principles that they want to live by or be known for effectively in the market and within their own employee base as well. But I think the what I've always advocated to my clients is that those cultures, even those values at the top line, really don't mean anything until you have teams who actually take those and make them their own. And how they do that effectively is by actually having those active conversations among the team, led by the leaders, but also, the entire team effectively weighing in on if you take a set of values as articulated by the organization, what does that mean for them as a team? Because every team is unique in its own way, it has its own strengths, its own personalities, its own weaknesses at times. And the only way that you have the lived cultural experience you want as a team is by actively cultivating it intentionally. And so more often than not, what I've advocated to teams is actually to have that conversation. Starting off, if you're handed a set of values by your organization saying this is how we want to be as an organization, actually translate that for your own practical team, if you will. Like, what does that mean for us? And when I talk about culture with teams, I often say, like, look, think about culture in the way of like, this is who we are, this is who we want to be or aspire to be, but also what we allow to happen. And it's that last piece in particular that I kind of encourage teams to think about because oftentimes team will kind of choose the happy path, and it becomes very sort of hallmarky sounding, if you will, of, yes, everyone's accountability, everyone wants transparency and so forth, et cetera. But what does that actually mean? And what does that mean, particularly when that does not happen? And that does not happen because of our own actions and our own behaviors, if you will. So I often encourage teams to effectively to explore not just the happy path, but also the not so happy path and what they do as a team in order to realize that. Many teams will actually, take the time to do a project charter, for example. And project charters are great, but they don't really go the depth that I think teams need to of articulating not just the what they do, but how they do it as a team and how they support and create, if you will, that sort of lived experience they really want to engender, if you will.
So totally, so much in here to explore. I want to go first to see if you and I agree on something.
Mm.
And the word I'm going to go towards oddly first is cynicism. So
Yeah.
so many times I've seen, because I think you and I have both done that large culture values work, maybe with the top of an organization, but then we get to that team level, and there seems almost like a shearing or such a gradient, a difference between what some people thought somewhere would be a great set of values of what we aspire to be, and then what actually plays out in teams. And there's this image I have in my mind of a team I was on where there was a poster outside the conference room with all the wonderful values and great words. And then we'd go into the conference room and you would see almost exactly the same thing play out. And the discontinuity between seeing the words on the poster and then seeing the lived behavior inside of a conference room, and nothing is said and nothing's called out. And in that moment, I become complicit in that too.
Yeah.
And like, I think sometimes people scratch their heads and say, why is there so much cynicism inside of organizations? And for me, that's quite often one of the roots. Like, I'm almost rather you don't put the values on the wall outside the conference room if we're not actually going to talk about inside this room how things play out. Have you
Yeah.
seen that, or is that tracking with you? Or
Oh,
what's your
it's
point of view?
unfortunately it's too endemic across too many too many industries because you're right. I mean, many times the values exercise that organizations become a communication exercise. Effectively, it's not. I think too many organizations don't actually take the time to go that additional mile, which is or the last mile for teams, which is articulation of values is one, kind of important aspect. I mean, it's important for organizations to articulate who they are and who they want to be, if you will. But the problem becomes when they don't actually provide the tools or training for the teams, because culture lives and dies within that team context. So many people actually spend most of their lives in organizations relating to their colleagues and their direct management, or maybe their layer above them, if you will, if they have skipped levels inside organizations. But ultimately, where they're living is where culture has to show up. And if there's a disconnect between the values as articulated at the organization level and their team experience, that's where the cynicism really kind of comes in. And what I encourage people to do, especially in teams, is to try to get past that cynicism for themselves. In some respects, look at the values that the organization hands down to teams as a springboard for a dialogue within the team, and in particular around the question of not living the way they want to live, if you will. And that really requires, cynicism is one C. I think there are three other C's that you kind of keep in mind: courage, curiosity, and compassion. So the courage to really take on that topic of cynicism, like, why are we not living the values that we say we want to within this team? Like, what stops us from having the dialogues and the experience we want to have? If there's a lack of trust, if there's a lack of psychological safety, that's your responsibility as a team to kind of work through that, because there's a lot of noise that can happen in organizations, but ultimately where you live has to be something that makes you feel safe and rewarded and supported. And if that's not happening, that's a team dialogue and leadership dialogue within that team to have. But that leads you to the second C, which is the curiosity piece of this. Like, in order to actually have, it's great you have courage to have that, but you have to honestly be curious. And that means hearing from everyone on the team, your introverts as well as your extroverts, about what's not working for them, and have a really good dialogue about what needs to change. Because I'm a firm believer that when people talk about culture change, if you're not changing people's experiences, you're not changing the culture. You will never change the culture. So no level of communication exercise or change management exercise will ever get to that point if you actually don't change the experience of those people in that culture. So in other words, shifting from a place of cynicism because the behaviors they're seeing around them is not mirroring what their posters on the wall are saying, to one of a place where they're actually agents for the experience they want to engender for themselves and for the others within their team context, and maybe even beyond. But it has to start with that team. And that third C comes in particular for that dialogue as well, which is that compassion piece of this. In other words, having compassion for not just others, but also for yourself, because part of that cynicism is a result of bad behaviors that aren't really dealt with the right way. And then you become complicit because you don't say anything or no one says anything, and it's not dealt with, and it becomes this elephant or series of a troop of elephants in the room that, if never addressed, will tend to fester within a team, and that becomes poison in the well for moving you away from the experience you want to have, if that poison remains there. So you almost have to have that sort of compassion and desire to sort of deal with those circumstances in a way that acknowledges both the dark and the better angels of our nature, and just at times, finding ways of moving beyond that for people, whether that's through apology, whether that's through asking for forgiveness or a clean slate to be realized. I mean, there are resets that have to happen within team context themselves, where complicity has allowed things to get to a point where there is bad blood, there is toxicity, and the only way you get past that, and similar to like what you would do in couples therapy, is actually talking about it as a couple, talking about it as a team, and reaching a better end state by just being honest with one another, including where you've hurt other people or been hurt in that process. But you have to have the courage, you have to have the curiosity, you have to have the compassion to work through all of that. Otherwise, you won't get to a better place.
Love that. Yeah, the courage and the curiosity and the compassion. Um, let's assume for a moment, let's just jump forward and assume a team did this. They could take some offered values or aspiration from the organization and then authentically turn that into the lived experience they want, the vibe, the way we're going to be when we're together. And maybe they use some of the same words from that aspiration above, but maybe they just put their own words to it,
Yeah.
the things that they want to say. This is when we're together in this power of proximity. This is what we want. We're going to microdose some courage and curiosity and compassion, and we get to this place where it feels like this is a pretty cool team. Like I'm grooving with this. This is nice. I want to now actually preserve and protect what we have.
Hmm.
Like this actually, I'm wondering, does this create like a need for some really healthy boundaries between this healthy and effective team and what's out there? Because sometimes what's out there isn't going to reinforce the good stuff that's in here. How do teams and team members then interact um, outside this team, outside of kind of this maybe healthy home base? What are some risks and what are some opportunities when teams encounter this?
Yeah, I mean, I think the team, I sort of almost use like a hot house metaphor. Sometimes when I talk about teams, like a good team is like a good hot house. You have to kind of maintain the boundaries in many respects, but understand that you have to engage with the larger population, whether it's other teams, whether it's a customer base external to you, and so forth. Ultimately, I think you have two responsibilities when you're engaging beyond your team. One is to live the values and that you believe in, that you've articulated within your team, and that you within your house are trying to maintain the goodness of throughout. They don't mean anything as values if you don't actually like live them beyond where you are, and they don't mean anything if you actually don't if they can't withstand conflict or challenge by others. And it's that last piece of this, I think it's very hard for people. People can be very conflict avoidant and so forth, but and that conflict is maybe the source of that may actually be you just living who you are, your values, who you are, how you want to show, how you and your team have talked about creating the lived experience that you want to actually have. By going out to other teams, you may experience teams or other individuals that are put off by that, who don't agree with that, who have their own view of what good looks like, and that's fine. There's no problem with that ultimately, but that shouldn't dissuade you from having the courage to live who you are and the values you want to live. But that leads down to the second path, which is part of the boundary piece of this as well, which is at some point there will be conflict with others. That's where the team aspect has to really kind of come into the fore, because your first duty as a team should be to your fellow team members. And when conflict has occurred with other people, like for example, if you are engaging with a team that's another part of your same organization you're in, but are of a more competitive or possibly sort of toxic kind of cultural attitude, if you will. So they're aggressive. They seem to be conflict embracing versus avoiding. They become sort of a problem for you. Don't carry that yourself. I think the first responsibility of that team is for you to feel like you can live the values you've talked about and have a place to come back to. But then don't avoid talking about that. I think that the way you create boundaries within teams is by effectively baking in certain rituals and practices within the team to make sure that the care and feeding of that team in good times and bad is being done appropriately. And good times are always the easiest ones. Like we can have, the icebreakers to get to know one another, et cetera, before we get into more sort of operational or transactional sort of engagement with one another. The relational becomes super, super important, but that's also a relational is super important when it comes down to the conflict, the dealing with conflict. So if I've dealt with somebody and I felt challenged, I've had a bad day because of another engagement with another team. I should feel comfortable coming back to my team and having that dialogue and said, look, here's what happened to me today. Um, Either how do I deal with that? And they become a source of brainstorming to make it of a better situation. So that person feels both supported and empowered with maybe an approach they did not think about, but that they would not have thought on their own. But they're getting it from the team, and the team now is aware of that situation and can make sure that they're coming back around to the individual to make sure that they're embraced and they're supported in whatever capacity. The other aspect of that though too is the learning within that team and knowing that you have someplace to go. So you may even come back and say, like, here's how I dealt with it. Did I handle it the right way? How should I have handled it? It's through these kinds of feedback loops and support mechanisms where the culture's lived in many respects. Like if you don't have this dialogue, if you don't provide the forums, if it's all business, business, business all the time versus having some relational and some engagement with your team, then that's where the cynicism can start to breed because you don't feel like you have someplace you can go. There's no sense of trust or safety even within your own team because I can't share I've had a bad day or get feedback on how to deal with a really difficult customer or a difficult colleague who's in another team. So I think you have to bring it back to the team. It all comes back to the duty the team feels to its members and to each other. And again, that sort of courage, compassion, and curiosity that has to sort of be there. That feeling of support. If that support is not there, then you're not really living the experience that you've said you want to engender. And I think that you can't just use a project charter, for example. I was talking about the project charter a little bit because project charters are a great formal mechanism for documenting, the what's and whys and the impact you want to have as a team. But culture experience is lived experience. Has to be reinforced day after day, week after week, month to month, month after month, year after year. If it is not, then it will tend to stagnate. It's like having a garden. Like you have to always weed that garden. You always have to make sure it gets the right nutrients, the right amount of sunshine, et cetera, in order for it to be healthy. The same is true for a team.
Yeah. I like that image of going outside your own hothouse or a greenhouse. I think that's the term I come from. But yeah, that place where things are grown in here, right? Where we're nurtured in sunlight and water. But then we go out into the world, and you're going to bump into other individuals and other teams. And I think one thing that's important is every team is unique. Each is diverse. And even though maybe we've all had the same encouragement from above to incorporate these values, every diverse team is going to have their twist on a vibe, their thumbprint, their way of doing things. And so when we go out of a team and interact with the rest of the world, we will encounter difference. We have to. And we should not ascribe to malice things that will just be ascribed to like that. That's the way that team rolls. That's the way they do it. That's their vibe. And yet we will also run into things that are malice or not good or maladaptive. And we have to know the difference.
Yes.
And I like that sense of being able to come back home, come back to the home base and say, I ran into this circumstance with so and so from that team or just that team. And it might prove to be difficult for us. And so, what's in our control as this team so that we can take responsibility for things that are most proximal, but then also influence things that are not in our control, but in our ecosystem. And I think teams, I'm going to kind of wrap these 2 points we've talked about. I think if teams do those, not just the clarity of the charter, why they exist, what they do, but also how they want to live and how they are making the aspirational values a true part of the lived experience, and then interface in a healthy way outside of the team. one of the things that I think happens in the end is that these teams become kind of net importers of great talent. Like people want to be on that team. Like the people talk, people watch teams, and you hear about that team with those members, that leader, the way they roll. I think people want naturally to be a part of healthy communities, healthy ecosystems, and learn from each other and be productive that way. Um, do you, but don't know if you agree with that point, but if you do or you don't, it's great. Do you see any other, in the end, positives or benefits for teams that take this approach we've talked about over the last few minutes?
Yeah, it's not just an attraction for new talent. It's also a great growth vehicle for existing talent. I mean, I think one of the things that I talk about with organizations, and I think one of the things you always be mindful of is teams by their nature are naturally refreshing entities. You expect people to retire. You expect people to come into the organization as well. That there has to be an engine for learning and feedback of that goodness you've created. If you created a really attractive environment, an environment where there is that sort of sense of support and care and safety and trust, it's a great place to work. You feel like you can grow within that environment and so forth. I think you have to think about those things very consciously as a leader, but also as teams, and that learning has to be shared. So I think that the best teams that I've seen are really ones of growth and learning. They are actually attractive partly because of growth and learning. It's one thing to be able to deal with difficult situations, but most people aren't necessarily trained to do that very well or very naturally. So if you actually have a team, I haven't seen the best teams are actually sometimes the ones that are seeds for other great teams, where they have actually created something wonderful. And then now you have natural progression within an organization that occurs where a team member becomes a leader of their own team. And they're carrying that sort of seed of goodness, if you will, into that next team. And they've done it in a way to allow them to not just understand the values piece of this, but also the rituals and the practices that need to be in place as a leader and as a team member in order to create their own hothouse, their own engine for growth and sustainability. Because I think it's one of the things that's missing a lot in sort of corporate education these days, is how do I not just the mechanics of doing my job, but how do I provide the right support and scaffolding, if you will, to create the right lived experience and culture I want to within my own team context? It's not a conversation or not a training session I've seen a lot of where there's actually handling that. Like, what are the practices I should be following? Like, how do I deal with conflict? All of that sort of stuff is really like sort of we're expected to sort of know that kind of coming in more often than not, and I think that's a really erroneous assumption in corporate development. Honestly, is the assumption that people just know. Well, they got along in kindergarten, so I guess they can get along in teens. It's just not the nature of the beast at all. So I think that's where good teams. There's a lot of discussion about teams being role models for others. I think that's great as a secondary benefit. I call it secondary because I go back to that what I said earlier. Their first duty is to each other and to the team. If they're a role model for others, that's wonderful, but that should not be their focus. Their focus should be living who they are, and if that looks like good to others, and it should, that's wonderful, and they can become agents for change in a larger organization. But at the end of the day, their first duty should be to one another, and that's partly what makes them attractive and great. But I think that they can be a great seed for growth for organization if the organization gives them the right care and feeding as well. So they need support beyond their teams.
The power of positive contagion, um,
Yes, exactly.
as opposed to the predictability of rolling out the same tools to every team to be used in exactly the same way.
Yeah.
Um, thank you. I've really enjoyed the conversation, David, and your comments. If anybody wants to get in touch with you, is there a way that they should reach out to email or website? Any contact information you'd like to leave with people?
Yeah, feel free. I'm on listed on LinkedIn, David M. Snavely, and feel free to reach out to me there. I'd love to communicate, and this is clearly a topic I'm passionate about. So
Yeah.
feel free to reach out to me, and I'd love to have a dialogue.
David, thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Right, pleasure has been mine. Thank you.